When I was young, I was diagnosed with a couple of issues of mental health, including OCD, anxiety, depression, and ADHD. Now, unfortunately for me, my therapist started treating some of these things, and also the fact that I was a preteen and then an early teenager, which is a tough time for your body and your mind. A lot of changes are happening in your body. He gave it a new name, which was first mood disorder, and then eventually he called it bipolar disorder. But at the time especially, there was a lot of shots in the dark, and as he gave me more and more medication for this disorder that I did not have, things got worse, and I ended up struggling with addiction.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Time for Change, the podcast that is here with you and for you with all the information you need on dealing with whatever hurts you or doesn't work for you, all the things that you are looking to change in your life to get you to the life that you want and deserve in every aspect of your life. I'm your host, Michelle Rosen. Hi, everyone that joined us today. So glad to have you here with us. We have today with us Jay Shifman, and we are going to talk about some very, very important things when it comes to your life and the things that you are looking to change and improve in your life. So, Jay, I'm just going to briefly introduce you, but before anything else, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here to chat with you.
I'm so glad you're here. And guys, Jay Shifman is all about stigma and destroying that stigma and how we can all do better and overcome those stigmas when it comes to mental health and substance misuse and addiction. And Jay founded his company, Choose Your Struggle, in 2015 with two distinct goals. One is ending the stigma and promoting honest and fact-based education around the topics of mental health and substance misuse and recovery, and also helping a lot of people do better in different parts of their lives, aspects of their lives. So welcome, Jay.
Again, thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to talk about these topics, which are so near and dear to my heart, and I truly think are some of the most important things, especially going forward, what we're seeing in the way our society is changing. I am very hopeful that some of these topics, which are in the past very underserved, are going to be more exposed, and people are going to be more willing to talk about them.
Yeah, and you know, Jay, those of us that are very passionate about what we do, especially in the field of helping others, we have our own stories. We have a reason why we're so passionate about those things. So what is your story? Why are you so passionate about this?
Well, I'll give you the short version because we'd be here a while. But very briefly, I was misdiagnosed with a very serious issue of mental health when I was younger. And that led down a terrible path that included struggling with addiction, surviving a couple suicide attempts, an overdose. And it really wasn't until I was deeply immersed in first a lockdown unit and then a long-term care facility that I started to sort of step back and realize what was going on in my life and try to retake control of it. I've now been in recovery for over 12 years and have spent the last about half of that helping other people, talking about these issues, and trying to do my best to get rid of a lot of the things that we were both intentionally and unintentionally mistaught on these subjects, and replace it with honest and fact-based education.
Jay, you're telling me something very important, and I want to go back to that because I want to fully understand what you're saying. You were misdiagnosed, and can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so when I was young, I was diagnosed with a couple of I would say very important but less serious issues of mental health, including OCD, anxiety, depression, and ADHD. Now, unfortunately for me, my therapist started treating some of these things and saw sort of the perfect storm of the treatment of these issues, the fact that I struggled with them at all, and also the fact that I was a preteen and then an early teenager, which is a tough time for your body and your mind. A lot of changes are happening in your body. And he saw this conflation, this perfect storm, And instead of realizing that it was all of these different factors, he gave it a new name, which was first mood disorder, and then eventually he called it bipolar disorder. Now, bipolar disorder is a very serious issue of mental health. It is something that I think we are woefully under researching and under treating. Things have gotten better since I struggled with this, over a decade or a decade and a half ago. But at the time especially, there was a lot of shots in the dark, and as he gave me more and more medication for this disorder that I did not have, things got worse, and I ended up struggling with addiction to a couple of those prescriptions and misusing all of them, and my life got pretty dark there for a while. And it motivated me, like I said, once I got into recovery and really got healthy again, which took a solid half a decade. I mean, it wasn't until 2015 or so that I started feeling healthy, and that's when I decided to dedicate myself this second chance that I got to making a difference.
It's so important what you're saying, Jay, because of two things that come to my mind. Number one, when people get diagnosed with something, so I just want to share with everyone how it works, how people get diagnosed, okay? There's a book that you, every therapist, right, the DSM, every
I got
therapist.
it right here behind me.
You got it right here behind you.
Yeah.
Believe me, I've been tested on it many times. So the DSM is a book that has all the criteria for diagnosis for every single mental health, mental illness, mental child out there. And it's very, very, very specific. A lot of things are interrelated. And so the first thing I want to say, and Jay, this has been on my mind for the longest time. When you guys go on TikTok, okay, and you diagnose yourselves or others, please, it's not that you say about someone that they're bipolar or they're a narcissist because you didn't get along with them and they do answer the criteria of a narcissist or a bipolar person. There's very specific criteria in the DSM. Number one. So that's very important to know. And number two, it's so easy to get misdiagnosed, even with all that criteria. And so, Jay, people go to the doctor and they tell them, oh, you have this physical problem, and they're going to seek a second opinion.
That's right.
I'm not sure that's so much the case with mental health. What are you seeing?
Well, so the first thing I want to say real quick is that I'm not on TikTok. I used to be. I got kicked off TikTok for the whole. It's a whole thing, but I'm no longer on TikTok.
Okay.
But you make a good point about the self-diagnosis, though, and an even better point about the second opinion. I actually say this all the time when I'm speaking in front of crowds. Is that my wonderful aunt is recently in remission from a struggle with cancer. And every step of the way, she got 3, 4, 5 opinions and got, because of that, the best treatment available. And yet, when it comes to our mental health, this was a stat I saw a couple years ago, and it may not be as true today. I hope it's gotten less. But at the time, a study found upwards of 85% of people never got a second opinion when they got a diagnosis for a mental health issue.
Wow.
Now, that is startling, and that is my story. We had this therapist who said, this is what you have, and my family trusted him. I trusted him. I was a teenager at the time, and we went, okay. And clearly, as that shows, I was not alone in that.
Yeah. And so if somebody's struggling right now and they're seeing different, I'm thinking in today's world, so 2022, I think that a lot of young people go on TikTok, read different, and I see that with my 14-year-old, read different things that people are posting about supposedly replacing, being the DSM for that matter, oh, I have this because I have this symptom. And if you have this, and all of a sudden, people become experts for diagnosis. So first of all, people diagnose themselves seeing all kinds of things on social media, which to me is extremely alarming. And then even if you go to a professional, that's still not, not a given. So what would you tell someone, Jay, considering the journey that you've been through, someone that says, I think I may have some depression. I think, my mood is not stable. I think I'm being a little OCD. What would you say to that person in terms of what they should do?
So personally, I think of it as a two-step process. Number one, take some time for yourself. I am a big believer in the mindfulness process of stepping back and sitting with your thoughts for a while, doing some deep inflection, some radical honesty. Right. Sometimes we shy away from truths that we know are right there in our conscious mind, but we run away from them because they're not the most pleasant thoughts. And once you've done that, once you've kind of gotten a handle on where you are, what you're feeling, sort of to our last point, get multiple opinions. And what's so hard about that, and I'm very conscious when I say that, is that it's very difficult to find a therapist these days. I can tell you this from personal experience. Recently, I moved to Philadelphia, where I live, and I love this city, a year and a half ago, and I wasn't able to get an appointment with a therapist covered by my insurance until 3 months ago. It took me a year and a third to find an insurance, a person who took my insurance to actually be able to see me. And it's made even harder now that, we have the because of COVID, more and more people aren't meeting in person. And for some people, internet access is still a problem. This is supposed to make things easier, and it does for some people. But for others, this is still a challenge. So I'm fully aware that finding multiple opinions is very difficult. However, what I would say is before you start treatment of any kind, please get more than one opinion. And if they don't agree, go get a third. It's very important.
It's so important. I absolutely agree with you. And yes, it is so difficult to get an appointment with anybody these days. And talk to me, Jay, about the accountability aspect of mental health, because it's almost concerning to me that people go on social media. They think they have something. Let's say they have a hard time. I'm just going to go through the process, right? They think they have something. They're not sure. They're struggling. They go on social media. They think they diagnose themselves. And then I find, and I read a lot of research on it, a significant difference between the people who manage the situation versus the people that let the situation manage them. So managing this situation means that you seek multiple opinions. You read a lot about it. You educate yourself as far as what else you can do other than psychiatrist medication. What are some things that you can do to help yourself? That's managing the situation. Being managed by the situation is when you become overwhelmed by the prospective diagnosis and helpless, and you just let the situation manage you. What has been your experience with this over the years?
Well, I think it's tough because for a lot of people, the first time these symptoms will manifest is in your teenage years, right? We know that now that for a vast majority, it's teenage, early 20s, that's the period. Yeah. Now, that's also a period where your brain is really still developing. And you and I as two adults can sit here and say that, oh, you got to do this. This is the rational response. But I, for one, was the farthest thing from rational when I was in this period of my life. Yeah. And so it is very easy to be like, well, teens, early 20s, here's the checklist. But then when you think back, especially for me, who at that time was struggling with my own mental health, was by my early 20s fully struggling with addiction, even if I had known those steps, I don't think I would have followed them. Let's just be honest here. Yeah. And so I think that the way I would answer your question is that is on the people who love and care for those people who are struggling to be there in the way that works for that person, right? And again, it's easy. I love my parents to death. They're both wonderful people. But too often in this period, their response was to lecture or to oh, you got to go see that, whatever, right? And instead of it makes sense. I'm not blaming them. I mean, that probably would be my response if I had children too. But I think a more empathetic way is to sit down and just be like, look, tell me what's going on. I actually want to know. I want to be here. Help me understand. And, I'm not a parent. I put that out there that I cannot pretend to understand what that experience is like when you're afraid that your child is struggling. But from working with countless parents, I always caution them to remember you've got to put the kid first, put yourself aside for a second, because you're going to come from a place of fear, a place of anger, if you're putting yourself first, and that's not going to help anybody.
So everyone out there that is, let's differentiate between the people that are struggling themselves with their own mental health, and sometimes those would be the same people, right? There's overlap with everything. And the parents, the family members, the spouses of someone who is really hurting right now. And, you know, Jay, there are people that did not have any specific or any mental health illnesses that were kind of latent, you know, that maybe they had them, and then in the pandemic, all of a sudden there's so much, you know, so many people suffer in terms of their mental health. And it can be very overwhelming to the family members, the spouses, the kids of what happened to that person. So it's so important what you're saying, that the most important thing to do is to be empathetic and to be curious and not to run away from having that simple discussion of tell me what's going on, even though it can be overwhelming at times. And you're not supposed to solve it for them or tell them what to do. Sometimes you just listen.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, let me be very, very clear. That's also very difficult for me. My wife would be the first one to tell you that I like to come in and say, okay, here's how we're going to solve this. And sometimes she just goes, you know, I appreciate that, but I really just need you to listen right now.
Yes. And it's so powerful to, you know, the ability to listen without solving.
Right.
Because as soon as you start solving the problem or trying to solve the problem for the other person and tell them what to do, you are making them feel weak. You basically tell them, you don't know how to do this, so I'm going to tell you what you need to do. I'm the strong one, you're the weak one. You know, I know better than you, with the best intentions in mind. And one of the most important things, I'm sort of, you know, bringing everyone behind the scenes of psychology, you know, one of the most important things is to listen and empower, you know, and help the other person find the strength and the power in themselves to solve their own problems to the best of their ability. Jay, you talk so much about stigma. And I kind of feel when I read that about you, I kind of felt that there was a lot of pain, you know, in your emphasis on fighting the stigma, destroying the stigma. Talk to me about the stigma.
Well, you're right. You know, that comes from personal experience, and I think that anyone who has struggled with an issue that is outside the norm has that experience, right?
Yeah.
For me personally, what that looked like was it took me over 5 years into recovery before I started talking about this. You know, people here or there knew about it, my struggles, but even some close friends didn't know, and it really manifested in the way that when I finally did tell my story to on stage to a room full of people, that night I physically felt a weight off my shoulders. That was always, to me, you know, that's a turn of a phrase that I never actually understood. You know, you hear people say that, and then I felt that night. And so that was a huge motivator into doing this work, was that I know how powerful sort of saying, forget this, you know, F the stigma can be. And so when I encourage other people to tell their stories, when you know, I've done a lot of storytelling events, especially over the pandemic, where I encouraged people who had never told their story before to get on camera and tell their story. And so many of those people now either do this as part of their work or have gone on to create other things, because once you feel that, you go, oh, wow, like this is powerful. I want to help other people do this as well.
So important. And you know, it goes both ways. We just talked about how important it is to listen. And here we are talking about how therapeutic storytelling is. So, you know, what is the best favor that you can do for someone who is hurting right now? Let them speak, let them tell their story, because they're hearing themselves tell the story and they are listening to themselves. And so it gets less overwhelming. And it's also a way to make sense of it all.
That's right.
And it's so important. walk me through the connection. I mean, we all know that there's a connection between mental health and addiction, but I want to hear your side of it. How did that connection happen to you?
Well, I think that in a literal sense, let's go back to what you and I were talking about earlier, is that addiction is in the DSM-5. I mean, this is a mental health disorder, is the way this is seen by the medical community. Yeah. For me personally, I am a full embracer of the idea that many great people have put forward, but I'm going to quote a good friend of mine who is no longer sadly with us, by the name of David Pozis, who wrote in his autobiography about struggling with heroin, unsafe heroin use, was that for him, using heroin was not, we like to kind of lump all drugs together, you're partying, whatever that BS, but for him, using heroin was filling a hole, right? He has said this countless times, is that if he ever found, and he tried all of them, a prescription that treated his depression the way heroin did, he wouldn't have used heroin, but it was filling that hole for him. And for many people, they don't understand that, right? They look at someone who's, let's say, using a drug like heroin that we see in the news all the time, and this idiot, this whatever, and it's like, well, from someone who's been there, right? I can tell you that we all have reasons. This myth that we've heard created about the person who, and I don't want to say myth, that's too strong a word, because this does happen, but it's been conflated to being the rule instead of the exception of that we hear all the time with the opioid epidemic, which is that, the high school quarterback who gets his knee blown up gets on Percocets and then switches to heroin. Does that happen? Of course that happens. Yes, that's real. It's terribly sad. But that is a very small percentage of the people who struggle with addiction. For most people, and I got to give a shout out to some incredible researchers who have studied this way more than I have. People like Maya Salovitz, Johan Hari, Carl Hart, these people who have gone in these communities and have said, okay, I mean, that does happen, but let's also look at the fact that, the jobless rates have exploded 20% in this community. Right. So the quality of life has dropped precipitously. And yes, you're seeing some people who were preyed upon, of course, but for a lot of people, when the rug is pulled out from under them and they can't find good mental health care, and drugs are right around the corner, that hole needs to be filled. And for a lot of people, unsafe drug use becomes the thing to fill that hole.
So how did that turn around for you? I mean, it sounds like a very accessible, unhealthy coping mechanism, so easy to slip into. So I don't know what happened to your friend that is now gone, but so self-destructive. How did you shift? How did you find your way out from addiction?
Well, for me personally, my story is a little bit different because, unfortunately for me, at the time, the entire world around me, everybody believed my issue was straight mental health. The drugs were seen as curing, not hurting. And it wasn't until I got to know other people with bipolar disorder that I went, wait, what they're going through doesn't look like what I'm going through. And I also got to know people who were struggling with addiction. I went, now that looks familiar. And it took me deciding that I was going to be done with this, that I wanted to get off of the prescription pills, and going through what's called step-down detox, which is the opposite of cold turkey. That's one myth I love busting. Cold turkey is not the way to go, especially if you're not in a medical setting. I sadly know too many people who have lost their lives to trying to quit cold turkey because they thought that was what you're supposed to do based on media. I mean, that's it, right? It's just media who talks about cold turkey, and cold turkey is super lethal. And so I did the opposite in a safer setting. It took me almost 4 months to get off of everything because I was on so many pills. But it really was just being frank, being pissed off about my life, being disappointed with what had become my day-to-day, and deciding I wanted to do something different. I have that streak in me that when I get when I set my mind to something like that and I'm angry about it, I'm the juggernaut. There's nothing stopping me. And for me personally, in that moment, I was tired of everybody else making decisions about my health that I didn't agree with, and I knew that getting off the drugs was the way to go, and I was right.
Do you remember a defining moment? Do you remember a time where you say, this is where something clicked for me, that because it sounds like you took charge. It sounds like you were managed by the misdiagnosis, the different substances, and it took you on a wild ride, and then you took charge and turned your life around. What happened?
Yeah, so the thing that finally got me mad enough to say I'm done, I was in, like I said, a long-term care facility that wanted me to stay on the medication. And there were multiple people who lost their lives in this we'll call it what we used to call it 50 years ago, a mental institution.
Yeah.
And it was finally when a good friend of mine there, a young woman who I'd befriended, I physically and just through our friendship stopped her from taking her life. I saw the signs when nobody else did. Yeah. And that to me was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, but in this case was the anvil that broke the camel's back. I could not fathom staying in this place that would have let this person that I cared about die. And I finally said, I'm done. I'm leaving. I do not trust this place anymore. And that was what kept motivating me was this desire for the first time in over half a decade to make my own choices about what I was going to do to treat my mental health. And whenever I faltered, I just had to pick myself back up. I was doing this thing alone. I was the only one I could really count on to know what was best for me. And that was really difficult, but it was the right move.
It's very, very interesting that you're describing that you felt angry, and that anger was the fuel. And so I think if anybody's listening to us right now and they feel angry about their life or about their finances or about their relationship or about any situation in their lives, whether if it's directly related to mental health or it's related to anything else, anger is not necessarily a bad thing. Anger is energy. It's just a question of what you do with it. I want to ask you, Jay, something that's been bothering me for a while, and it has to do with stigma. And for the longest time, I was trying to also educate people about the stigma of mental health. I'm noticing a different phenomena with the younger generation, and I'm wondering if you've encountered that too. I'm noticing the opposite. So whereas in the past it was about busting the stigma, and if you had mental health issues, it was, a label on you. I almost feel that in the younger, generation, there's almost a glorification of you've got to have something. Am I the only one that sees that? Do you see the same thing?
I don't know if I would say it's a glorification. Where I agree with you is that we are seeing a strong pendulum swing to the other side.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd use the word glorification. What I would say is that this idea of hiding our weaknesses is I agree with you, is gone. I don't think that necessarily that has to be a bad thing. I think that there are many communities where this is a strong positive. I also sort of think in a broader spectrum, when you see drastic sea change, it's very rarely accompanied by a sort of slow tick. Most of the time it is this strong swing, and then we kind of come back and settle in a good spot. And I think we're seeing that strongly right now.
I agree with you so much. And in that sense, it's a positive thing. So, Jay, last words of advice to anybody who thinks that they have a certain mental health problem, struggling with any kind of mental health challenge, got diagnosed with any kind of mental illness, and feels, with all the pendulum and everything and all the changes in the world when it comes to perception, self-perception, other people's perception when it comes to mental health, really feels overwhelmed, doesn't know what to do. What would you advise them?
Well, I would say that the most important thing, and again, using my own experience here, the biggest mistake that I made was not reaching out, not connecting with other people about this issue. You know, when I was at my lowest and I attempted suicide twice, after I survived, I had so many people who were angry, who were scared, who reached out and were like, how could you not talk to me about this? And, you know, my brain at the time was telling me this, nobody cares, you know, keep this all inside, BS. And I can tell you again from experience, that's not true. People want to be there. There are people who care. So don't hold it in. Definitely reach out to someone. And if you are a person who is scared that there's somebody in your life who is struggling, you know, sort of going back to a point I made earlier, the right way to approach them is not to lecture, not to, you know, demand that they tell you what's going on, but try to be that person, try to be the empathetic person, share with them, make sure they know there's an open communication, that they can talk to you, and just be the person that they feel comfortable coming to.
It's so true. It's so true. And Jay, where can people find you?
Well, you can find me at my website, which is jshifman.com. My company's website is Choose Your Struggle. I'm on all social media as either Jay Shifman or Choose Your Struggle.
I love that. Everyone that is listening to us right now, first of all, Jay, thank you so much for joining us. It's been so interesting to listen to you and so insightful. And I'm sure that anybody that's been listening to us that is struggling with mental health, whether for themselves or with someone else around them, I think the most important thing out of everything that we talked about today is just reach out. And it goes both ways. If you are the one struggling, reach out to someone. People are there for you. You are not alone. Reach out and they will help you in any way that they can. Find the people in your life to reach out to. Don't hold it, you know, in your gut. It's just not the right thing to do. And with everyone who is struggling with people in their lives that are hurting, and it hurts them to watch these people hurt, reach out to those people as well. Because the best thing you can do for someone is to just be a person. Just listen and just empower them and be empathetic and just be there. Let them know that they're not alone. So thank you, Jay, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone who joined us on this very important episode of Time for Change. And whatever you are struggling with in your life right now, whatever your challenge is, remember, it's in your hands and it's never going to be the right time. So take the first step. Thank you for joining us today.